Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Had a whole bunch of people send me this story, including Alan. Thank you very much. We talked about this previously, where the newspaper in Kansas was raided by the police and universally condemned for doing that because the newspaper has a job to do and they're allowed to do it. And it is enshrined in our First Amendment that they are allowed to do their job without such intervention. And I'm being kind by calling that intervention, more like interference and beyond. But former reporter for Weekly Kansas newspaper agreed to $235,000 settlement to settle part of her federal lawsuit. The lawsuit is still proceeding, but at least somebody got out for $235,000. John Hanna of the Associated Press wrote this. A former reporter for the newspaper has agreed to accept $235,000 to settle part of her federal lawsuit over the police raid on the paper that made a small community the focus of a national debate over press freedoms. That settlement removed the former police chief in Marion from the lawsuit filed by former Marion County Record reporter Deb Groover, but it does not apply to two other officials she's sued over the raid. That would be the sheriff and the county prosecutor. So her lawsuit is among 5 federal lawsuits filed over the raid against the city, the county, and 8 current or former elected officials or law enforcement officers. Her attorney did not immediately respond to emails Friday seeking comment. An attorney for the city, its insurance company, the former chief, and others declined to comment but released a copy of the settlement agreement after the Record filed an open records request, and a copy that was also given to the Associated Press. So, when they settle big lawsuits like this, they do often have to reveal what they settled for. That is the entity paying the money if it involves tax dollars. And that is something that people always say, Steve, you should really emphasize that when you sue the quote-unquote government and they have to pay you money, well, they get their money from us. So it's not like they just, print the money. I know what you're going to say. Yeah, they actually do print the money. Yeah, they do, but not the police department, for instance. The former police chief led the raid back in 2023, and they also raided the home of the publisher and the home of a then city council member who had been critical of the then mayor. Notice all of these thens. These people were in power back then. They're not anymore. Marion is a city of about 1,900 people among the Prairie Hills, about 150 miles southwest of Kansas City, Missouri, and the Record is known for its aggressive coverage of local government. Gotta love a little newspaper that will stand up to government. At the time, the chief said he had evidence that the newspaper and a reporter and a city council member had committed identity theft or other computer crimes in obtaining information about a local business owner's driving record. All of the people that he targeted said they did nothing illegal, and no charges were ever filed. And we've commented about this before, and this is a common thing you need to understand. There are times when if the police want to hassle you, they can hassle you, and then you don't get charged with anything, but the hassling is really what they were trying to accomplish. So the old joke is that a police officer can arrest you, take you to jail, have you booked for something, and they just drop the charges, but you still spent an afternoon or morning going to jail and getting booked and all that. It's a pain in the rear end. So here, these people's lives were disrupted. As you recall, the newspaper had to struggle to get its next edition out, and I believe other newspapers stepped up to help them. Their competition stepped up to help them. That's how everybody thought this was wrong. So a federal lawsuit filed by one of these people in the newspaper alleges that the raid also caused the death, you'll recall this, the next day of the 98-year-old mother of one of these people because she lived there and was subjected to all of this. And he and the paper's attorney have suggested that the raid was a response to the paper investigating the backgrounds of some of these people. So they seized Gruber's personal cell phone. They searched her desk, and she had no connection to the driving record, but was merely looking into the past of the police chief, the former or the then police chief. The raid sparked national outrage, and the then police chief resigned in early October, less than 2 months after the raid. Legal experts have said the raid likely violated state or federal laws. I would say it likely violated state and federal laws, but it's a minor distinction. Is it a conjunction or a disjunction? But this is one of those things. And the reason it made such huge headlines is it is so far out of what ought to be happening. And freedom of the press is something that we talk about quite a bit here on this channel and elsewhere. And of course, the First Amendment talks about it. And it's something that we learn when we're quite young about how important it is to have a free press. And so when the police raid this place and in essence shut it down, because why? You got to wonder about that. You really do. And I mentioned before that I wrote the book about the Italian Hall disaster in 1913. It was during a strike, and there were a lot of strong feelings on both sides. And shortly after the disaster happened, a local newspaper, run by Finns, by the way, ran a story about the Italian Hall disaster itself, and they used the Finnish word for murder and said it had been a murder. And that, of course, implies that somebody did something with real ill intent to cause the deaths of all these people. And the interesting thing is that I wrote a book about it, and I used the word murder in the title of my book because I do believe it was a form of murder. I believe the man who cried fire, at the very least, did so with a blatant disregard for the lives of others, which would raise it to the level of some kind of criminality that would fall into the same category as murder. And the sheriff in 1913 went and raided the offices of that newspaper and arrested everybody they found, including the bookkeeper. And they rounded them all up and they threw them in jail. And they held them there long enough to keep them from publishing anything else until things calmed down a little more. And eventually, those people who ran the paper got out of jail, and they actually fled the state and moved the operation of the newspaper to another state altogether. Very, very crazy. But that's how things were back then. Here, they got back up and started publishing as quickly as they could. But the notion that the police will come in and shut a newspaper down. In 1913, they claimed that the newspaper was inciting a riot. Inciting a riot. That's always one of those strange things you hear about. Was there a riot? No. Okay, then how did they incite one if there was no riot? Attempting to incite a riot? That's not what they said. They said they were inciting a riot. And so there's no excuse for this. And so it looks like one defendant has gotten out, but the other lawsuits are still proceeding. But one defendant paid $235,000 to get out. And it's an interesting resolution, but you have to understand that there are a lot of times where cases have a bunch of defendants and a bunch of claims, and they're good claims, and defendants appear to be on the hook for something. And you'll see some people settling early just to get out. But you'll also see where someone's going to hang on to the bitter end just to see if they might be the one who can get out of it with a jury finding them not liable for something. We'll see. But this is one of these cases where I can't imagine anyone wants to take this to trial on the defendant's side, because you're going to have attorneys on the plaintiff's side talking to the jury about the First Amendment and the freedom of the press and how you don't hear about police busting in and shutting down newspapers for a reason. Because when I mentioned it happened back in 1913, that's a long time ago. And I can only think off the top of my head of two examples. 1913 and this one. That's how unusual it is. So something that unusual, you'd think somebody would realize, wait, we're about to do something that never happens. We should ask ourselves, is this what we should be doing? And they should have thought better of it, but they didn't. So we'll see what happens as this proceeds, but as of right now, a former reporter for the weekly Kansas newspaper agreed to a $235,000 settlement for part of her federal lawsuit. So the rest of the case will proceed. I will update you. Alan and everybody else that sent it, thanks a lot. John Hanna of the Associated Press wrote that version of it. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. A dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work.